Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to our /MaliciousCompliance, where people follow exact orders to spite someone. And in today's episode, what's worse than horrible, snobby bosses, guys? We've got Karen bosses getting demoted, getting embarrassed by their employees, Karens getting fired, and one OP tells a story about their encounter with a CEO that they'll never forget. It's a wild one, so I hope you enjoy the stories. Hit subscribe if you're not subscribed, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. A long time ago, I used to manage a small, franchised-owned beauty salon. It was my first management role I've ever taken on. I built the salon up after a low period. I was well respected by my staff because I was an empathetic listener and I understood the needs of my staff. The district manager was anything but that. This woman was hired as the manager of a new location in our district. That location was set to open a month after she was hired, but she somehow convinced our franchise owners that she'd be a perfect fit for the role of district manager, so she was promoted quickly. At first, I didn't see my district manager all that much. Remember that new location that was opening up? Well, she would tell me that she was over at that location, getting things in order to be ready by the opening date. I took her word for it, and I managed to run my location just fine without her guidance, even though I was new to management myself. Well, after that location was good to go, she would promise me that she would spend a day with me at my location, and when that day would come around, I would get the, "Oh, something came up at another location" text from her. I was starting to get suspicious. In the meantime, a new manager was hired on at another location in the district. This woman became my mentor as she's had years of experience in the industry. The district manager was supposed to train this new manager on her role. Well, the district manager gave this woman the runaround too. She would say stuff like, "Oh, I'll be here today," and then later send a text message saying something came up at another location. Little did district manager know that us location managers were talking to one another, and we quickly realized that this woman was sitting at home while collecting a paycheck. And here's the thing, the owners quickly began to realize what this horrible district manager was doing. However, they were reluctant to fire her because they had no solid evidence of what she was doing. At this point, the district manager caught on that her job was on the line, and she really started to throw her weight around. She fired multiple employees at all locations who had no previous write-ups. These particular employees were the ones who saw her BS and weren't afraid to stand up for themselves. She then starts enforcing really stupid tasks on us managers, and soon enough, turnover was high at each location. Even some really good long-term employees left after she started to show up more. And here's the malicious compliance. Eventually, I had enough of putting up with her crap, and on a particularly rough day, I called her out on her BS. I went ahead and I called the owners and told them everything of what she was doing. A few days later, the district manager pulls me aside, and she suggests that I find a job elsewhere and that she could pull some strings. Well, I did exactly just that, and I found a new job without her help, of course. I gave my franchisors my notice, and on my very last day, horrible district manager was demoted to my former position, and she was given a huge pay cut. My goodness, guys. The real villains in this one are the franchise owners. Like, how can you employ someone who's that lazy and useless and has no idea what they're doing? And what makes things worse is because of that Karen boss, they probably not only lost out in revenue, but they lost long-term employees, which in some cases is invaluable. I don't know, guys. In my opinion, they really should have fired her because what more do you need? She was sitting at home, collecting a paycheck, not doing her work. How's that not enough evidence? So 8+ years ago, I used to work as a business analyst for a large multinational construction materials company. I was a good employee and they were a great employer. I had been given 2 promotions in my time there and been moved to several domains in the IT department. I learned a lot. A role then came up to be a senior business analyst, and for various reasons, I was denied the promotion. Not a big deal. I understood the reasons. I really did. A more deserving external candidate got the position. I was still given the opportunity to work in that domain, a great learning opportunity. A few successful projects later in the new domain, I asked if I could be promoted to a senior business analyst. My manager spoke with my director, and his response was, well, he needs to prove himself. And hearing that, I had to laugh. Don't get me wrong again, my director was a great guy. After all, he did promote me twice, and he gave me the opportunity to learn all these various new domains of the business. Nothing against him, but the explanation pissed me off. And here's the thing, I would have been satisfied with, there's no budget this year, or I don't think I'll get approval for an in-place promotion. HR was one of the domains I supported, so I know how things go. So I just kept learning the new domain, and I started applying for various jobs outside the company. It took a few months, but one role finally clicked. My current job was $88,000 a year, plus a 15% bonus paid annually. The new job was $110,000 a year, with a 30% bonus paid quarterly. And that's the funny thing. The director wanted me to prove myself, so I just proved my worth to another company. I got a $22,000 raise on my base and doubled my bonus percentage. My manager then comes and says to me, so the director's kind of upset you're leaving. Is there anything we could do to keep you, like make you a senior? And that's when I told him I only started looking because they said no to being promoted. Otherwise, I was and still am happy here. The money's hard to turn down though. In hindsight, I'm glad they denied me the promotion. I would have never left that company otherwise and not been on my current career trajectory. I just love how the director clearly regrets saying that, but too late, right? Like, it's always funny when bosses realize that their good employees are going to leave and they go into full panic mode. Like, they'll start offering raises, bonuses, and in this case, an offer to become a senior role to get them to stay. Like, where was this when I asked for it months ago, right? What a joke. And like Ovi said, that denial of the senior role was the push they needed to go for bigger and better things. Okay, so this happened many years ago. I worked for a top US banking institution. In our building, all of the other departments were allowed to wear blue jeans on Fridays. My manager decides that our department has to wear business attire on Fridays. And just to be clear, we had no customer-facing presence. Also, our department processes check deposits from ATMs, and they come in mesh bags. They were usually quite filthy and were frequently wet in bad weather. So when our manager told us that we couldn't wear blue jeans on Friday like every other department, the entire team was upset. And here's where we cue the malicious compliance. The next Friday, I went to my closet, and I found the most mismatched outfit that I could put together, sticking completely to business attire. We're talking pastel floral print shirt with pants with bold colored stripes. I put it on and proudly walk into the office. My manager happened to be on vacation that week, so nothing was said about my ridiculously mismatched outfit. However, fast forward to the next Friday. I once again chose the most hideous combination of an outfit that I could put together. And once again, I walk into the office with my head held high, confident in my business attire. Now imagine my surprise when I walked in and everyone on my team had on hideous combinations of clothing. As you can imagine, my boss walks in and sees everyone in their various outfits, and the look on her face was priceless, all 15 of us in hideous outfits, but all meeting the business attire dress code. She then pulled all of us into a meeting, and she told us that our attire was entirely inappropriate for the business environment, and she would have to write each and every one of us up. And this is when I asked her to pull out the company handbook and to read the definition of what it said as business attire. She reads it, and it stated something like clean and pressed business attire, consisting of slacks, skirts, or dresses, and clean pressed shirts or blouses. It went on to say something like no blue jeans, t-shirts, clothes with holes, no sleeveless shirts, and no athletic or gym shoes. This is when I ask her where in the guidelines does it say anything about whether the outfits had to match or not. She of course couldn't find anything, and she said she would have to contact HR to discuss with them what her options were to write us up. Needless to say, none of us were ever written up. She did, however, say that we still need to dress in business attire. Word quickly spread to the other departments about her forcing us to wear business attire. And the next week, 2 departments around us decided that they would also dress up in hideously matched clothing. The managers of those departments quickly got in touch with our manager and put pressure on her as they didn't like how their employees were dressing. Our manager then calls us into a meeting, and she told us that we could wear blue jeans on Fridays going forward. Malicious compliance wins. My goodness, I wish OP shared a picture or something because that sounds absolutely amazing. Not to mention frickin' brilliant. Like, I never ever would have thought to put on mismatched business attire. Some people are truly next level when it comes to stuff like this. And what makes it even better is the fact that this malicious compliance includes uniting the workforce against management. Again, I wish everyone who participated got together to snap a group picture because what they did was legendary. That said though, I never understood the whole business attire in an office setting where you never deal with customers. Like, as long as the work gets done, why can't people dress casual all the time? So my friend, who I'll call Sandy, worked at a travel agency. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's coworkers, who I'll call Jane, was an older woman in her early to mid-60s, and she was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off, over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would then claim overtime hours by going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered that after she had hired Jane, that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and she won a settlement. That said, after a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and she offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal, and she took over the business while keeping Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy, for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try her shenanigans though, but she was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Now, despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide, since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come into work on the weekend or after hours in order to try to make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. The 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything, so Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 workdays just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She had told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and she needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went to the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork. And this is when she discovered that only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary, where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates that Sandy would be out of office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel that Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emails Jane, telling her that she would have to deny her days off since she had been told they were unavailable, since Sandy would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and she outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane that she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, and that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane counters in her reply without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie. She said that she's a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years, and she can't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she's done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire, and she was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off, and she left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit or retire. Sandy then contacts her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned/retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, to let her finish out her 2 weeks, with no further severance pay required, since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went to the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She then put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had clients' phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and she greets everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was slightly taken aback when she noticed that Sandy's boyfriend was seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informs her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check, compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks of wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and she went into panic mode saying, "But I didn't retire, I'm not ready to retire." Sandy then responded that indeed she had retired. She had given her notice and she had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire, I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee, who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then points to a box containing Jane's belongings and wished her a happy retirement and then told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifles through the box and she noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information wasn't there. She then insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do so, explaining that it was property of the business, that it contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. At this point, Jane's shock had now turned to anger and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informs Jane if she didn't leave, they would have to call the police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dials 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrive, and Jane immediately ran to the door, ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client information. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client information. The other officer then re-enters the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding onto her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings. They took it outside to Jane and told her she needs to go home. And to rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy puts up a large sign in the window of the business, congratulating Jane on her retirement and even putting out a small announcement in the local newspaper, doing the same thing. The icing on the cake was when Sandy was filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, or retires. She made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane wasn't able to collect unemployment insurance benefits. Oh man, the icing on the cake was delicious. And guys, this is exactly why you never threaten your boss with quitting to get what you want. Because if you're useless, they will just show you the door, and Jane totally played herself. And here's the thing, a long-time employee doesn't always mean a good employee. Poor Jane probably thought she was indispensable. Like, how can some people be so deluded? I don't know. Another thing, that retirement announcement totally cracked me up. That is like pinnacle level pettiness, and I love it. So a few years ago, I worked armed security at a hospital. The Greater Health System owned 3 large hospitals, each with a 24-hour trauma center. It had a couple of smaller county hospitals and dozens of clinics scattered across 3 states. I worked at one of the bigger hospitals in a bad part of town. There were legitimate security threats on a daily basis here. One day, I was told to stand at the main entrance and to keep staff out. Apparently, some middle management person wrote a new policy that staff members are to enter and exit the building through the west entrance only. The main entrance was to be used by patients and guests, and they didn't want employees cluttering the main entrance because, God forbid, people see medical staff upon entering a hospital. My task was to stand at the door and tell nurses, doctors, cafeteria staff, facilities, janitors, etc. to use the west entrance. Anyone who refused had their name written down, and they would be reprimanded later. Now, I had other stuff to worry about, like homeless people fighting people in the ER, and people running on the helipad to take a selfie, or dudes on PCP yelling at the wheelchairs. You know, actual security problems. The main entrance posting was a waste of my time, and it dragged on for several days, until one day, a man wearing a suit, leading a gaggle of important people all in business attire show up. The ringleader had an employee ID badge, and he was speaking enthusiastically to the group. They were heading straight for the main entrance, and that's when I say, "Sorry folks, gotta use the west entrance." The ringleader responds, "What?" I tell him, "Hospital policy, all employees must use the west entrance." The ringleader says, "We're just gonna use this entrance," as he points to the door. I respond, "Okay, but I'll need to take your names down. Your supervisor will be informed." At this point, the ringleader stares at me like the biggest idiot alive, and he holds his ID badge in front of my face for an uncomfortably long time. I took his name down and every single member of his gaggle with painful slowness. I should also add that they were all very polite, despite my obvious lack of F's to give. Shortly after, the security supervisor arrives. He says to me, "How's it going?" I reply, "Not bad, I have a dozen or so names." I then show him the list. The supervisor, upon seeing the list, goes, "Oh my goodness, is that?" He then points to the ringleader's name, and I say, "I don't know. His badge said something like Chief something officer." The guy looked important. The supervisor says, "Chief Executive Officer?" I tell him, "Yeah, I think that was it." Supervisor quickly walks away, and it turns out the CEO of the health system was bringing a group of potential investors for a tour of the place. He was never informed of the main entrance policy change, and he was not impressed to be stopped at the entrance of his own hospital by some rent-a-cop. Suddenly, as if by magic, staff could use the main entrance again, and I could return to actual security work. Absolutely hilarious, guys. And honestly, if I were an investor, I'd be very impressed at the level of security at that hospital. Here's hoping the CEO turned that annoying incident into a positive thing, and he was like, as you can see, we take security and policy enforcement very seriously at the hospital. Even I'm not allowed to enter just any door, and I'm the head honcho. And this person shares a similar encounter with a CEO who they don't know is the CEO. So one of my first jobs was at a factory doing floor care in the office areas after they closed. Sweeping, mopping, stripping and waxing, the whole works. One night, I was working alone in a hallway near the main lobby, just mopping my little heart out when I heard footsteps approaching. I had signs up, but I could tell these guys were deeply engrossed in a folder, discussing something. I didn't want them to fall, so I called out, "Please be careful, gentlemen. The floor's wet and a bit slick." The guys were about even with me now. They looked up, made eye contact, and they laughed, before one of them said, "Oh, we're hardly gentlemen. Don't call us that." Without missing a beat or even thinking about it, I responded just as they walked past me, "If you say so, ladies. Have a good night." The two burst out in hysterics. They thanked me for the laugh and then continued upstairs to the conference room. Shortly after, my boss comes running down the steps. Apparently he saw that interaction from the second floor and his eyes were wide. And he said, "Why would you say that?" To which I respond, "I don't know. They said they weren't gentlemen and to not call them that, and ladies was the first thing to come to mind." Anyways, that's when I found out I called the CEO and president of the nationally recognized corporation ladies on their way to a meeting. You know what? That encounter was such a wholesome one, like just people laughing with other people. And I only say that because there's a lot of CEOs out there and presidents who probably have a superiority complex who would have looked at OP like they were an idiot. I don't know, maybe I've read too many Karen boss stories, guys, but the fact that the big bosses were nice and they genuinely shared a laugh with an employee who's mopping the floor, it just makes me happy. I love it. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of r/malicious compliance. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, subscribe so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's an r/ entitled People episode, where Karens are absolutely getting destroyed. Guys, go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.